For years, fans of the hit TV show MASH believed that the cast was one big, happy family, a tight-knit group whose chemistry on screen reflected genuine friendship behind the scenes. But the truth, hidden for decades, is far darker than anyone could have imagined. Among the laughter, the camaraderie, and the heartwarming episodes, there was one relationship poisoned by resentment and frustration. One co-star, who once worked closely with Gary Burghoff, grew to utterly hate him, and only now do we finally know why. Gary Burghoff, who played the beloved and quirky Radar O'Reilly, was adored by fans for his innocence and charm. But behind the camera, many insiders describe a very different man. One who was difficult to work with, demanding and often distant from his fellow cast members. At first, everyone tried to excuse it as the pressures of fame or perfectionism. But for one castmate, the tension grew unbearable. The smiles on set masked a brewing storm that would eventually explode and change their relationship forever. It wasn't just ego, it was betrayal. Burghoff's behavior during the later seasons of MASH reportedly drove a painful wedge between him and his co-stars. Arguments about screen time, pay disputes, and even on-set arrogance turned once friendly faces into bitter rivals. The man who had been the heart of the show suddenly became the source of its deepest divide. Years later, when the truth finally came out, fans were stunned. What really happened behind those iconic army tents wasn't comedy. It was conflict. And for the co-star who confessed, the resentment never faded. He said, "People think Radar was sweet, but the man behind him was something else entirely." Now, the real reason for that hatred is out, and it changes how you'll see Gary Burghoff forever. When MASH hit television screens in 1972, it wasn't just another war sitcom. It became one of the most iconic shows in TV history. Its sharp mix of comedy and tragedy made audiences laugh, cry, and think. But behind the cameras, things weren't always as lighthearted as they appeared. And at the center of the tension stood Gary Burghoff, the man everyone thought was the heart of the show. Burghoff's character, Radar O'Reilly, was universally loved, innocent, loyal, and full of heart. He represented the moral compass of the series, the soldier who kept things running while chaos swirled around him. But the man behind Radar was far more complicated. Colleagues often described Gary as brilliant yet moody, a perfectionist who demanded control over even the smallest details. "He had this incredible talent," one former crew member once said, "but he wanted everything to go his way." At first, his co-stars admired his dedication. Alan Alda, who played Hawkeye, often defended him, saying Burghoff brought a unique humanity to the show. But as the seasons went on, something began to change. Gary grew restless. Fame was becoming a burden. He felt overlooked, underpaid, and overshadowed by his castmates, especially by Alda, whose influence on the show's creative direction was growing. According to insiders, the breaking point came during the show's 4th and 5th seasons. Burghoff allegedly clashed with several members of the cast and crew, particularly Wayne Rogers, who played Trapper John, and later Mike Farrell, who replaced him as B.J. Honeycutt. While others worked as a team, Gary often isolated himself. He didn't mingle much, one cast member recalled. You could feel the tension when he walked on set. One co-star, whose identity remained private for years, reportedly confessed in later interviews that working with Burghoff became unbearable. "He was talented, no doubt," the actor admitted, "but he had a temper. He could be cold one minute and emotional the next. You never knew which version of him you were going to get." The same co-star later admitted, "I hated him, utterly, and not because he was successful, because he made everyone else miserable." Rumors of Burghoff's ego spread quietly through Hollywood. Some claimed he constantly complained about his paycheck, arguing that his character was more important than others. Others said he resented the attention Alda received as the show's unofficial leader. It all boiled over one day during filming, when Burghoff reportedly stormed off set after a disagreement about his lines. "It was like a bomb went off," recalled a member of the crew. Everyone just froze. You could tell he was done. Not long after that, Burghoff announced he was leaving MASH. Officially, he cited exhaustion and a desire to spend more time with his family. Unofficially, insiders knew the real reason. He couldn't stand being there anymore, and some of his castmates were quietly relieved to see him go. "We respected him," one actor admitted years later, "but we couldn't work with him anymore." When his final episode aired, the heartbreaking "Goodbye, Radar," fans across the world cried. They thought they were saying farewell to one of television's purest souls. But for the people who had worked behind the scenes, it was a very different kind of goodbye, one that came with relief, frustration, and lingering resentment. After his departure, the atmosphere on set reportedly improved. Cast members became closer, the energy lighter. Yet, even after all those years, the bitterness remained. That unnamed co-star who had spoken out against Burghoff later said, "The fans loved Radar, but they didn't have to deal with Gary." In the decades since, Gary Burghoff has largely kept to himself, appearing occasionally in interviews but rarely discussing his time on MASH in detail. For fans, the revelation that one of the show's most beloved faces was also one of its most difficult personalities was shocking. A reminder that sometimes the sweetest characters on screen can hide the deepest storms off-screen. Among the many talented actors who brought MASH to life, few had as close a working relationship with Gary Burghoff as Alan Alda, Wayne Rogers, and later Mike Farrell. Yet while Alda tried to keep the peace and Farrell often avoided conflict, it was Wayne Rogers, the actor behind Trapper John McIntyre, who reportedly found himself at the center of Burghoff's growing storm. Their friendship began with promise. Two sharp comedic talents, both quick-witted and capable of carrying scenes with warmth and timing. But off-camera, the tension simmered until it boiled over, leading to one of the most bitter off-screen feuds in television history. When MASH first aired, the chemistry between Radar and Trapper was undeniable. Fans loved the way Burghoff's innocent optimism balanced Rogers' dry humor. But behind that chemistry, the two men clashed. Rogers, known for his calm professionalism, often found Gary's perfectionism exhausting. Gary wanted everything to go through him, one crew member recalled. He'd argue about camera angles, punchlines, even costume choices. Wayne just wanted to act and move on. But Gary couldn't let things go. The breaking point reportedly came during the show's third season. By then, Burghoff's temper and mood swings had become common knowledge. He was frustrated by what he saw as a lack of respect from producers and co-stars. Rogers, tired of constant tension, began to pull away. He was difficult, Rogers allegedly told a close friend. You'd spend all day trying to make a scene work, and Gary would throw it off because he wasn't happy with one line. It wore everyone down. Crew members described how Rogers' patience eventually snapped during a heated rehearsal. Burghoff had demanded a rewrite, claiming the humor didn't fit his character. Rogers disagreed, and the two exchanged words loud enough for the entire soundstage to hear. "It was one of the worst fights we ever saw on set," said a longtime assistant director. They weren't just arguing about a script. They were arguing about respect. After that day, the relationship never recovered. Rogers, who had already been frustrated with the show's contracts and pay disparities, decided to leave MASH after the third season. Publicly, he cited creative differences. Privately, those differences included a deep resentment toward Burghoff. Years later, when asked about their time together, Rogers reportedly said, "Radar was lovable, Gary wasn't." While some colleagues tried to defend Burghoff, pointing out his intense commitment to his craft, others quietly agreed with Rogers. Gary was brilliant, but he had a hard time separating himself from his character, said one co-star. He carried the weight of the show on his shoulders, and it made him hard to be around. When Rogers left, Burghoff's behavior reportedly worsened. Without his old scene partner, he became increasingly withdrawn. Mike Farrell, who joined the cast as B.J. Honeycutt, tried to form a friendship, but even he later admitted that Gary seemed unreachable. The warmth that Radar radiated on screen was replaced by a cold distance in real life. Rogers and Burghoff never reconciled. Friends say that even years later, Rogers could barely bring himself to talk about MASH. He respected the show, one insider explained, but not everyone he worked with. Burghoff, for his part, avoided public feuds, though in later interviews he hinted at feeling misunderstood. "It wasn't easy being the youngest one on set," he once said. "Sometimes passion gets mistaken for arrogance." The feud between Burghoff and Rogers became one of MASH's hidden scars and a behind-the-scenes rift that contrasted sharply with the show's message of camaraderie and compassion. Fans who once imagined the cast as a real family were stunned when stories of the animosity surfaced years later. In time, both men went their separate ways. Rogers found success in business and occasional acting roles, while Burghoff stepped away from Hollywood altogether, choosing a quieter life devoted to painting, music, and family. Yet for those who worked on MASH, the memory of their feud lingered like an unhealed wound, a reminder that even on television's most beloved sets, friendship can turn to bitterness when egos and emotions collide. When Gary Burghoff announced he was leaving MASH after its 7th season, the decision sent shockwaves through both the cast and fans around the world. For millions, Radar O'Reilly wasn't just another character, he was the soul of the 4077th. His boyish innocence and loyalty made him a symbol of purity amid the chaos of war. But behind the scenes, Gary's departure was far less sentimental. Those who were there remember tension, exhaustion, and the quiet relief that followed his goodbye. Officially, Burghoff told the press he wanted to spend more time with his family. It was a statement that fit his gentle public image, the devoted father stepping away from Hollywood's madness. But insiders knew better. The years of frustration, creative clashes, and behind-the-scenes arguments had taken their toll. Gary was burned out, yes, but he was also isolated. The same perfectionism that made him brilliant had also made him difficult to work with. And by the end, most of his castmates had emotionally checked out. Still, when the writers crafted Goodbye Radar, they made sure his exit was unforgettable. The 2-part episode became one of the show's most emotional moments. Radar's farewell to Hawkeye and the rest of the 4077th left audiences in tears, unaware that behind those scenes, real feelings of resentment and exhaustion hung in the air. Some crew members later said the tears weren't just acting, they were relief, sadness, and maybe even guilt, all mixed together. After Burghoff's departure, the dynamic on set changed dramatically. The tension that had quietly clouded the production began to lift. New cast members stepped into leadership roles, and the energy among the remaining actors grew lighter. It felt like we could breathe again, one insider admitted years later. Gary's talent was unmatched, but the stress that came with him was gone. Meanwhile, Gary struggled to adjust to life after MASH. He took on a few small TV roles, even returning for the spin-off after MASH. But the magic never quite returned. Away from the cameras, he seemed to retreat from the spotlight, moving into painting, music, and family life. Though he spoke fondly of MASH in later years, he rarely mentioned the people he once worked beside. There were wounds there, wounds that time never completely healed. Wayne Rogers, on the other hand, found peace long before Burghoff did. He transitioned successfully into a career in finance and television commentary, leaving acting mostly behind. In rare interviews about MASH, he was diplomatic, never mentioning names, but fans who read between the lines could sense the lingering bitterness. "It was a great show," Rogers once said, "but not everyone was easy to work with. Sometimes you just have to walk away." When asked about Rogers years later, Burghoff's response was polite but distant. "Wayne was a pro," he said carefully. "We had different ways of working, and sometimes that happens." Yet those who had seen the two men together on set said the coldness ran much deeper than creative differences. "They couldn't even stand in the same room by the end," one production assistant revealed. It was like watching two magnets repel each other. As MASH continued without Radar, the show reached even greater heights, culminating in its legendary finale, Goodbye, Farewell, and Amen, which remains the most watched episode in television history. Many fans expected Burghoff to return for the finale, but he declined, reportedly citing personal reasons. For some, it felt like the final confirmation that the wounds from his time on the show had never fully healed. In later years, as nostalgia for MASH grew, interviews and documentaries began peeling back the layers of what really happened behind the scenes. Cast members spoke candidly about the pressure of maintaining a hit show and the toll it took on everyone involved. Alan Alda, always the diplomat, summed it up best. We were like a family, and like any family, sometimes love and frustration live side by side. Today, Gary Burghoff's legacy remains complicated. Fans still adore Radar O'Reilly, the sweet, innocent soldier who made them laugh and cry. But those who worked closest to him remember a different side, a man whose genius came with fire, whose heart clashed with his own ambition, and whose relationships bore the scars of that struggle. His exit may have closed one chapter of MASH, but it also revealed a truth as timeless as the show itself, that even in a world built on laughter, real emotions can wound deeper than any script ever could. Decades passed after MASH ended, but the shadow of the tension between Gary Burghoff and his castmates never completely faded. For years, both men, Gary and Wayne Rogers, avoided mentioning each other's names in interviews. Fans speculated, journalists hinted, and former crew members whispered, but no one knew the full truth. That silence only fueled curiosity. Why had two beloved actors from one of TV's greatest shows grown to despise each other so deeply? The answers began to surface slowly, years later, as time softened old grudges. In the early 2000s, during a reunion special, the surviving MASH cast reunited to reflect on their experiences. It was meant to be a celebration, a fond look back at a show that had defined a generation. But even then, Gary's absence spoke volumes. He declined to appear, citing personal reasons, though insiders believed he simply didn't want to reopen old wounds. Alan Alda, always diplomatic, hinted at what lay beneath the surface. In one interview, he said, Gary was a complex man. He was incredibly talented and sensitive, but that sensitivity could make things difficult on set. It wasn't about hatred. It was about personalities clashing under pressure. His words were kind but revealing. They confirmed what many had long suspected, that the tension had been real, but perhaps not born of cruelty, rather of pain and pride. Around the same time, Wayne Rogers finally broke his silence. In an interview promoting his book, he was asked point-blank about Gary Burghoff. Rogers paused before replying, Gary and I didn't always see eye to eye. He had his ways and I had mine. But I'll say this, he was one of the most gifted actors I ever worked with. What he brought to Radar, no one else could have done. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was the closest thing to peace fans would ever hear. Behind those carefully chosen words, though, was an undertone of lingering resentment, a reflection of how hard it can be to truly forgive when egos and emotions have clashed so deeply. Gary, too, began to open up later in life. In rare interviews, he acknowledged that his time on MASH had been both a blessing and a burden. It was the best job I ever had, he said in one interview, but it was also the hardest. I was young, emotional, and I didn't always handle things the right way. There were times I wish I could go back and do differently. That confession surprised many. For decades, fans had viewed Gary as a private man who avoided controversy. But in those few reflective moments, he showed vulnerability, a recognition that fame, pressure, and pride had played their part in the cracks that formed among the cast. After Wayne Rogers passed away in 2015, many wondered how Gary felt. He didn't issue a public statement, but those who knew him said he was deeply affected. One of his friends told a reporter, Gary never hated Wayne. It was frustration. Two strong personalities who didn't know how to communicate back then. Deep down, I think Gary always respected him. As documentaries and retrospectives about MASH began airing on streaming platforms, a new generation of viewers discovered the behind-the-scenes stories that had once been hidden. Younger fans were shocked to learn that the warm, humorous chemistry they saw on screen masked years of tension, exhaustion, and quiet heartbreak. But even with that knowledge, they admired both men more, understanding that the brilliance of MASH came not from perfection, but from flawed people doing their best to create something extraordinary. In the end, time did what anger could not. It healed. When asked in one of his final interviews what MASH meant to him, Burghoff smiled softly and said, "It was my family. Families fight, they fall apart, but they also leave a mark on your heart that never fades." Those words, simple yet profound, seemed to close the chapter once and for all. Gary Burghoff will always be remembered as the kind-hearted Radar O'Reilly, the man who could hear the helicopters before anyone else. But for those who look deeper, his story is also one of human imperfection, of ambition clashing with emotion, of talent tested by ego, and of how time can turn even bitterness into bittersweet reflection. And so, the truth finally came out, not in anger but in honesty. Gary Burghoff wasn't the villain. He wasn't the hero either. He was just a man who, like the character he played, tried to do the right thing in a world that rarely made it easy.